The most dangerous environment you will ever navigate is the one that looks almost normal. Not the overtly hostile, the obviously broken, the environment where the dysfunction is visible enough to be named and documented and eventually escaped. That kind of toxicity, however painful, has the mercy of clarity. You know what you are dealing with, you know what is being done, and approximately who is doing it. You can orient yourself against something visible. The most dangerous environment is the one where the toxicity is ambient, where it lives in the culture rather than in specific people, where it arrives not as attack, but as atmosphere, where the damage accumulates not through dramatic incidents but through the slow, daily, nearly imperceptible erosion of the things that matter most. Your standards, gradually lowered by proximity to lower ones. Your judgment, gradually clouded by the constant noise of poor judgment presented as wisdom. Your sense of what is normal, gradually recalibrated by an environment that has defined normal as something you should not accept. You may be in that environment right now. You may have been in it for years. You may have adapted to it so thoroughly that you have stopped noticing the adaptation, stopped feeling the daily erosion, because the daily erosion has become, simply, the texture of ordinary life. That adaptation is not weakness. It is the survival response of a human organism in a persistently difficult environment. But it has a cost that compounds in ways that are invisible until the debt is enormous. A cost to your clarity, your energy, your sense of what you are capable of, your relationship to the person you intended to become when the environment was not yet shaping you. Arthur Schopenhauer spent much of his intellectual life in environments that were hostile to what he was producing, academic institutions that dismissed his work, philosophical communities that celebrated what he found hollow, social worlds that operated by values he found fundamentally dishonest. He could not simply leave. Not all of them, not all at once, not without costs that exceeded what leaving would gain. And so he developed something more durable than escape, a philosophy of inner sanctuary so complete, so well-constructed, so genuinely habitable, that the toxic environment surrounding it could not breach the walls. This is that philosophy, and it may be the most practically important thing you encounter in a very long time. Let's begin with what toxicity actually does at the level of mechanism before we talk about defense, because understanding the damage precisely is the only way to prevent it accurately. Toxic environments operate primarily through normalization. This is their most powerful and most insidious mechanism. They do not typically assault you directly. They gradually redefine the baseline of what is acceptable, what is expected, what is normal, until behaviors and dynamics that would have appalled you in a healthier context have become simply the way things are. The standard drops in increments too small to trigger alarm, but large enough, accumulated over time, to produce a total shift that would be unrecognizable to the person you were when you entered. This normalization works because human beings are fundamentally calibration machines. We assess everything in relation to the things around it. Beauty, quality, fairness, intelligence, appropriate behavior. None of these have absolute scales. They are assessed relatively against the context in which they appear. And a context that has systematically lowered the reference points has, in doing so, systematically lowered the standard against which everything is measured, including, eventually, yourself. The second mechanism is contamination through emotional contagion. Human beings do not experience emotions. In isolation, we are profoundly social creatures whose emotional states are continuously influenced by the emotional states of the people around us. In a toxic environment, the ambient emotional register, the chronic low-grade anxiety, the competitive resentment, the performative cynicism, the exhaustion that masquerades as sophistication enters you whether you choose it or not. Not because you are weak, because you are human. And humans absorb the emotional weather of their environment, the way skin absorbs temperature. The third mechanism is the corruption of perception. Toxic environments are typically organized around a particular version of reality, a shared narrative about how things work, who is trustworthy, what success looks like, What is possible that serves the environment's dominant interests, rather than the interests of the people navigating it? Prolonged immersion in this narrative, without the corrective of regular contact with genuinely different perspectives, gradually shapes perception in ways that are very difficult to detect from the inside. You begin to see through the environment's eyes rather than your own. And seeing through the environment's eyes means using the environment's values to assess your own worth, your own possibilities, your own judgment about what deserves to be taken seriously. Schopenhauer's response to all of this begins with a concept he returned to throughout his work: the independence of the inner life from the outer. He believed, with an absoluteness that was genuinely radical for his time and remains radical for ours, that the quality of a person's life is determined almost entirely by what happens inside them, by the quality of their consciousness, the richness of their inner world, the depth and the vitality of their engagement with their own thinking, and almost not at all by the external circumstances that most people spend their lives attempting to arrange in their favor. This is not the shallow optimism of someone telling you that attitude is everything. Schopenhauer was not an optimist. He was possibly the most committed philosophical pessimist in the history of Western thought, and he held his pessimism with a rigor that earned it the right to be taken seriously. He did not believe the world was good, or that life was generally pleasant, or that external circumstances were irrelevant. He believed all three of those things were false. What he believed, and what his philosophy was organized around demonstrating, was that the inner life was the only domain over which genuine control was possible, and therefore the only domain worth investing in as a foundation. The external world, its opinions, its structures, its toxic environments, and its welcoming ones, was the domain of fortune, of contingency, of forces that could be influenced but never fully controlled. The inner world was yours, completely, unassailably, regardless of what surrounded it. The person who has built their inner life on this foundation, who has genuinely invested in the quality of their consciousness, the depth of their thinking, the richness of their private engagement with ideas and beauty, and genuine understanding, carries something into any toxic environment that the environment cannot reach. Not because they are invulnerable to discomfort, but because the thing they most essentially are does not live in the place the toxic environment is capable of touching. Let's be specific about what that inner sanctuary looks like, because philosophy without architecture is aspiration without shelter, and aspiration without shelter collapses under the first serious storm. The first element is what Schopenhauer called the life of the mind, not as an abstraction, but as a daily practice of genuine intellectual engagement that exists independently of the environment's recognition or participation. In a toxic environment, this practice becomes the most important thing you do. The reading that happens before the workday begins, the thinking that occurs on the walk that has nothing to do with the walk's destination, the ideas engaged with in private that have no relationship to the performative intellectual life of the environment, no audience, no recognition, no function in the social economy of the toxic system. This is not escape, it is maintenance. The way a musician practices scales, even when no performance is scheduled, not to produce anything immediately useful, but to keep the instrument capable of what it was built to do. The mind in a toxic environment is under continuous pressure to contract, to simplify, to adapt its operations to what the environment rewards. The private practice of genuine thinking resists this contraction with the only force capable of resisting it, the continuous exercise of the capacity itself. The second element is the maintenance of what Schopenhauer called aesthetic experience, the regular encounter with genuine beauty, genuine artistry, genuine creative expression, in whatever form genuinely moves you. He believed that aesthetic experience had a unique power, the capacity to temporarily lift the individual out of the will's relentless, striving out of the competitive, comparative, envious, anxious mode of consciousness that the toxic environment amplifies into a mode of pure perception where the individual self and its concerns temporarily dissolve and something cleaner, quieter, and more real takes their place. In practical terms, The music that genuinely moves you, attended to with genuine attention rather than as background noise. The literature that engages your actual thinking rather than flattering your existing opinions. The art that produces in you the specific quality of stillness that nothing else can produce. These are not indulgences in a toxic environment, they are sanitation. They are the cleaning of the instrument that the environment is continuously dirtying, maintained with the regularity that contamination demands. The third element of the inner sanctuary is the one that Schopenhauer's philosophy makes most specific and most radical. The active, conscious, repeatedly renewed refusal to accept the toxic environment's accounting of your worth. Every toxic environment runs an accounting system. It assigns value according to criteria that serve its own internal logic, its hierarchies, its political structures, its dominant personalities' needs and insecurities. In a healthy environment, this accounting is reasonably aligned with genuine merit. In a toxic one, it is systematically distorted. The people who thrive in it are not the people with the most genuine competence or the most authentic contribution, but the people who are most skilled at navigating the specific dysfunction that the environment rewards. The intelligent person in this environment is almost always disadvantaged by the accounting, because the qualities that make them intelligent, the genuine standard they hold their own thinking to, the refusal to pretend certainty they don't possess, the discomfort with the intellectual shortcuts and the performative confidence that the environment prizes these qualities are not what the toxic accounting rewards. What it rewards is something else. The political agility, the performed certainty, the strategic flattery, the comfortable reproduction of the existing order's preferred ideas. And the intelligent person is typically unwilling or unable to fully perform these things without the self-compromise that costs too much to sustain. Schopenhauer would have recognized this immediately. His response is precise. The toxic environment's accounting is wrong. Not just unfavorable wrong. It is measuring you against criteria that have nothing to do with the actual quality of what you are producing or what you are. And accepting a wrong accounting, even partially, even provisionally, even in the name of not making a scene, is the most corrosive thing you can do to the inner sanctuary you are trying to maintain. Reject the accounting explicitly, privately, firmly, and repeatedly. Not to the toxic environment. Announcing your rejection of the environment's values is a separate question, one that requires strategic judgment rather than philosophical clarity. But in your own interior, with the clarity of someone who has genuinely examined the criteria being applied and found them to have no authority over the actual question of your worth. Now, let's address the hardest dimension of this, the one that most discussions of toxic environments carefully avoid, because it requires confronting something uncomfortable about the person being discussed. You are not untouched by this environment. Even if you are reading this with the clear-eyed recognition of a person who understands exactly what is happening around them and has never lost the thread of who they are, you have been touched. The normalization has reached you somewhere. The emotional contagion has registered in your nervous system. The accounting, however explicitly you have rejected it, has landed somewhere in your unconscious processing and influenced something. Schopenhauer was ruthlessly honest about the difficulty of maintaining genuine interior independence in the face of sustained external pressure. He did not suggest it was easy or that the intelligent person sailed through hostile environments unaffected because their philosophy was sound. He understood that the pressure was real, the erosion was real, the daily cost of maintaining a genuine self in an environment organized around a different vision of what self means. This cost was real and had to be actively managed rather than philosophically wished away. The management looks like this. Regular, honest auditing of what the environment has reached in you. Not the grand, dramatic self-examination that produces insight and then is forgotten, but the quiet, consistent practice of asking, with genuine honesty, where your standards have dropped, where your thinking has simplified, where your judgment has been shaped by proximity to poor judgment without your noticing it. The audit is not an occasion for self-criticism. It is the maintenance of the instrument, the clearing of the sediment, that accumulates in any consciousness operating in a contaminated environment. And the honest finding of that audit, the places where the environment has made inroads that you did not authorize, is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of genuine human functioning in a difficult situation. The failure would be not to look. The failure would be to assume the inner sanctuary self-maintains without the continuous, active investment that all genuinely inhabited spaces require. Let's look at what Schopenhauer's own life demonstrates about this practice, because he is not a theoretical example. He is a lived one. He spent the most intellectually productive years of his life in Frankfurt, in a degree of voluntary social withdrawal that most people would experience as isolation. He had concluded, through the long experience of watching what academic and social environments did to serious thinking, that the protection of his inner life required the radical management of what he allowed into it. He limited his social engagements. He maintained daily routines of walking, reading, and thinking that had the quality of a practice rather than a preference. He developed relationships with his poodle famously that provided genuine emotional warmth without the political complexity and the intellectual contamination of the human social environments he found corrosive. This is often presented as eccentricity. It was not. It was a precisely calculated management of environmental input in the service of maintaining the conditions under which his genuine work was possible. He understood, from direct experience, what the wrong environment did to his thinking, and he arranged his circumstances accordingly, accepting the social costs of that arrangement with the pragmatism of someone who had weighed them accurately against the alternative. He did not always have this luxury. Earlier in his life, in Berlin, embedded in the academic environment he grew to find toxic, he watched what happened to his own thinking under the pressure of institutional expectations, social performance, and the continuous noise of an intellectual community he found intellectually dishonest. The Frankfurt years were the response to that experience, the deliberate construction of an alternative, more protected environment once he had the freedom to construct it. Most people do not have that freedom immediately. They are embedded in environments they cannot simply leave by financial necessity, by relationship, by the absence of alternatives that are clearly better. And for those people, for most of us, in most of our lives, the philosophy of inner sanctuary is not a counsel to escape, but a practice of preservation within circumstances that cannot be immediately changed. Here is the practice, as specifically as it can be given, while remaining genuinely applicable across the enormous variety of toxic environments in which people actually live. The first discipline is the boundary around your standard. The toxic environment will continuously present you with the option of lowering your standard, producing work that is good enough by the environment's degraded measure, rather than genuinely good by a genuine measure, holding positions that are strategically convenient rather than honestly arrived at, participating in the collective performances of certainty and agreement that the environment rewards. Each individual instance of this lowering feels manageable. The cumulative effect is the loss of the standard itself, the forgetting, through disuse, of what genuine quality actually felt like. Maintain the standard in private even when you cannot maintain it in public. Produce the genuine version in whatever form is available to you, even when the environment only receives the compromised version. Do not let the gap between what you are producing for the environment and what you know yourself capable of close entirely, because the day that gap closes entirely is the day the standard has been surrendered and the inner sanctuary has been colonized by the territory it was supposed to be protected from. The second discipline is the maintenance of genuine friendships outside the environment, not relationships within the toxic system. Those relationships, however warm, are necessarily shaped by the system's dynamics and serve the function of helping you navigate the system rather than helping you maintain your genuine self in relation to something larger than the system. Genuine friendships outside the environment are the corrective, the regular encounter with people who know you by reference to your actual character rather than your role in the toxic hierarchy. who apply different and healthier standards to their assessment of you, who can see clearly what the environment has been doing to you, precisely because they are not inside it. The third discipline is the practice of beauty and genuine intellectual engagement, maintained with the consistency that makes it a practice rather than an occasional indulgence. Not when the environment happens to leave you energy for it. The environment will never reliably leave you energy for it. Before, despite. Instead of the additional hour spent processing the toxic environment's latest iteration of its dysfunction, the private life that the environment cannot reach, maintained actively against the gravity of a system that would prefer you had no private life at all. There is something Schopenhauer wrote late in his life that is as close to a direct instruction as his famously indirect philosophical style ever produced. He wrote that no one can see over their own height, that what any person is capable of perceiving and evaluating is limited by what they themselves are, by the quality of their own consciousness and the development of their own faculties. The small mind cannot perceive greatness, not because greatness has concealed itself, but because the instrument available for perceiving it is insufficient to the task. In a toxic environment, this principle operates as a mercy. The people who do not see your value, who apply the environment's degraded accounting, and arrive at the conclusion that your contribution is unremarkable, your thinking is standard, your worth is approximately what the hierarchy assigns it. These people are not wrong because they are cruel. They are wrong because they are limited. The instrument they are using to assess you is insufficient to the task, and the insufficiency of their instrument is not a reflection of the inadequacy of what is being assessed. It is simply the condition of their perception. You cannot make a person see over their own height. You cannot compel genuine recognition from an instrument that was never built for it. What you can do, the only thing that is actually available to you in this situation, is refuse to accept the assessment of an insufficient instrument as the authoritative account of what you are. Schopenhauer did this for decades. He had to. And what he produced in those decades, the body of work that now shapes the thinking of millions of people who will never know his name, was produced precisely because he maintained his own accounting of its worth in the face of an environment's accounting that was simply categorically wrong. What does it mean to be genuinely untouchable in a toxic environment? It does not mean you feel nothing. The toxicity registers, the daily indignities accumulate, the exhaustion is real. The loneliness of being the person who sees clearly in an environment organized around seeing selectively, this loneliness is one of the specific burdens of intelligence in difficult circumstances, and it has no clean solution. It means that none of these things reach the core, that the toxicity can press on the surface, can produce discomfort, fatigue, frustration. The grinding daily cost of maintaining genuine standards in an environment that does not require them, without breaching the inner sanctuary where the actual self lives and the actual work happens. The surface registers everything, the core remains. This is not the immunity of the person who has grown cold or the indifference of the person who has stopped caring. It is the specific, hard-won integrity of the person who has invested seriously enough in their inner life that the outer world's worst does not determine the inner world's quality. It is the fortress Schopenhauer described, not made of stone but of philosophy, of genuine intellectual engagement, of the private practice of standards and beauty and honest thinking, maintained with the consistency of someone who understands that these things are not luxuries in a toxic environment. They are the only things standing between you and the environment's ability to make you into its own image. So here is what you do starting now. Not when the environment becomes less toxic, not when you find the energy the environment has been consuming, not when circumstances finally align in a way that makes it easier. You build the inner sanctuary with whatever materials are currently available. You identify the private practice that the environment cannot reach, the reading, the thinking, the creative engagement, the genuine friendships outside the system, and you invest in it with the seriousness that it deserves, which is the seriousness you would give to the most important infrastructure in your life, because it is. You audit your standards regularly, and restore them where the environment has lowered them, without drama and without self-punishment, simply as maintenance, the way you would clean a room that has collected dust, not as evidence of failure, but as the ordinary, continuous work of keeping the space habitable. You reject the toxic accounting explicitly in your own interior every time it arrives, with the firmness of someone who has genuinely examined the criteria and found them to have no authority. Not once it will arrive again, and the rejection must be renewed. But the renewal becomes easier with practice, the way any act of genuine self-possession becomes easier once the muscle has been developed. And you remember in the moments when the environment is loudest, when the pressure is heaviest, when the distance between what you are and what the environment is willing to recognize feels most unbearable, that the instrument being used to assess you is simply not built for what it is attempting to measure. The accounting is wrong. You are not what the toxic environment says you are. You are what you have built, quietly and persistently and at genuine cost, in the inner sanctuary that no environment has ever been able to reach because you have refused, with everything available to you, to let it. That refusal is the most important act of intelligence available to a person in a difficult world. And it is, in the end, the only kind of untouchable that genuinely lasts.